members of council, members of Senate, members of the convocation, the student representative structures, the provincial leadership structures, members of the executive, Professor Fikile Mazibuko, former DVC of the college and former Vice Chancellor of the University of Zululand, the Reverend Lindani Lomo, as well as the Reverend Tulani Ndlanzi of the United Congregational Church of Southern Africa, Professor Lebu Molezane, deans of schools, in particular the Dean of the School of Education, Professor Thabo Msibi, as well as the Dean of the School of Religion, Philosophy and Classics, Professor David Sporret. I've already acknowledged the Program Director, Professor Smangaliso Kumalo, Dr. Sibusiso Masondo, members of the Greater Durban community, especially the Ink or Inanda area where I come from, incidentally. So we extend a very, very warm welcome to them, the entire university community as well. But most importantly, we want to extend a very, very warm welcome to the Dube family, the family of Umafuguzela Dube, who are also represented today, as well as our guest speaker and his family, Dr. Bongani Ngulunga, all protocol observed. Today we celebrate the 17th year of the John Langalibalele Dube Memorial Lecture Series. The lecture started in 2003 in the School of Religion at the then University of Natal. With the merger in 2004 and the subsequent establishment of the J.L. Dube Chair in Rural Education under the leadership of Professor No, if it was the 1990s, I would have taken cover by now. Okay, let me repeat. With the merger of the universities in 2004 and the subsequent establishment of the J.L. Dube Chair in Rural Education under the leadership of Professor Lebu Molezane, the college saw it fit to have an annual memorial lecture that recognizes Ubaba Dube's legacy in terms of education and theology. Since then, the lecture has been co-hosted on behalf of the college by the School of Education and the School of Religion, Philosophy and Classics. Dr. Dube was a theologian of note and an astute politician, having been instrumental in the founding of the ANC and leading it. He was also a man of letters who pioneered scholarship in African languages. His essay, Isita Somuntu Uqobo Lwakhe, meaning a human being is his or her worst enemy, earned him an honorary doctorate in philosophy. Dr. Dube also published influential novels such as Insila Kashaga, as well as essays on human behavior. And you will agree with me that one of the fundamental challenges facing our society in this day and age is to how to be a human being in the midst of other human beings. He also established the first isiZulu newspaper in South Africa, known as Ilanga, which is still in circulation to date. The isiZulu newspaper that he established from the donations he received from his associates abroad focused strongly on justice, human rights, land rights, as well as native ownership. This is not surprising. Since 1879, and particularly from 1906, Africans had been denied their inalienable right to land, a spiritual resource as far as African indigenous theology and philosophy is concerned. These issues remain topical to date, and one could argue they are at the very, very core of the divide between one could argue, the youth and the older generation. We are yet to develop land policies that speak to the philosophical and existential realities of the vast majority of the African population. Perhaps what is striking about the legacy of Ubaba Langalibalele Dube is that he did not ask, "What should my country do for me?" Rather, he was forever preoccupied with his responsibilities towards his country. He was very passionate about education. Ohlange High School, and I've been there many times, we competed fiercely with this school when I was growing up, has produced many leaders of note in various spheres of life. In fact, in the period preceding the transition to the new democratic dispensation, it was a center of excellence, and I challenge all who have graduated from this school and similar schools to re-establish the excellence associated with these schools in line with the visions of the founding mothers and fathers. Of royal descent himself, indeed, he is a member of the Kati royal family. Dube was able to transcend the Kolwa or converted and the Kaba or unconverted binary. He was a friend of Inkosi Dinizulu Kacicwa Kampande, advising him on many political matters during what was arguably the most difficult period in the history of the Zulu royal family and South Africa at large. The social, cultural, and intellectual legacy of Dr. Langalibalele Dube dovetails neatly with the vision of the University of KwaZulu-Natal and the College of Humanities. This is more so in terms of the centering of African indigenous knowledge systems, particularly the development of African languages for the purposes of wider communication in the sciences, in technology, and scholarship in general. He was one of the early scholars of decoloniality and analysis of the knowledge power matrix long before the term came into vogue. Let us build on this legacy as we seek to find solutions to the complex social ills facing our society. Ills such as the violence directed at women and foreign nationals. In this regard, ladies and gentlemen, it is illuminating that Dube also wrote about human behavior, ukuziphatha. He was a nation builder par excellence. The humanities need to lead the debate and interventions on how best to deconstruct and reconstruct our families and communities in the post-independence era, an era of so many opportunities, as well as profound marginalization and loss of meaning for some. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my singular honor to welcome all of you to tonight's event, in particular the Dube family, as well as our speaker and his family, to this very important event, honoring one of our luminaries on the African continent, Dr. Langalibalele Dube. I thank you.
Can I touch these things? Well, I'm a BBT. You know what a BBT is? Yes, born before technology, so I'm afraid to touch these things. Good evening, everybody. As I've been introduced, my name is Relebuhile Mulezani, otherwise known as Lebo. And as my DVC has already said, all protocol observed. I want to start today by acknowledging that we are not okay in South Africa. I want us, as we enjoy tonight's lecture, to stop and remember the many girls and women who have been raped, beaten, and killed in our communities. Just earlier today, I was reading about a 3-year-old who was raped by a 39-year-old man in Khayelitsha. And I was asking myself, As we toil away in our scholarship, what difference does it make to that 3-year-old? How could we have prevented her brutal violation at the hands of a, anyway. So this to me suggests that our scholarship, including the scholarship around J.L. Dube, must in fact impact the lives of the people with whom we live in our communities. As part of its research and community engagement at UKZN, among its other activities, the university and its colleges are mandated to focus on developing and disseminating knowledge through seminars and public lectures such as this one. The annual John Langalibalele Dube Memorial Lecture is the College of Humanities' contribution to this project. As has been said, beginning in 2003, the lecture was hosted by the then School of Religion on the Pietermaritzburg campus. With the establishment of the J.L. Dube Chair in Rural Education, which I currently hold, the School of Education and the now School of Religion, Philosophy and Classics have collaborated over the years in organizing and alternating the hosting of the lecture on the Pietermaritzburg campus and the Edgewood campuses. My colleagues and I are fortunate to have the support and leadership of the DVC and our two heads of school, Professor Sibi and Professor Spirit. Most importantly, over the years, we have had the support of the Dube family, and I would like to thank them again today. They will be thanked properly later, but I want to thank them now. Thank you for your continued support. Just to give you a glimpse into the history of the lecture, over the last 5 years, and I'm only starting 5 years, we have hosted the following speakers. In 2014, we hosted Dr. Gcina Mhlophe speaking on the topic, Writing Women, Gendering History. What would it mean to look at the 20th anniversary of South Africa's democracy from the perspective of Nokutela Dube? In 2015, we hosted Dr. Duma Ndlovu, who spoke on the topic, Reconscientizing South African Communities Towards Self-Reliance and Self-Respect, a ghost dance with John Langalibalele Dube and Steve Bantubiko. 2016, we hosted Professor Ndongela Masilela, who spoke on the topic, the South African Intellectual and Political Culture Enabled by John Langalibalele Dube in founding Ilanga laseNatal newspaper in 1903. 2017, Dr. Maureen Tong spoke on the topic, Violence on and Through the Land, Violence on Women's Bodies, evoking John Langalibalele Dube's voice in contemporary debates. Last year, Professor Chad Berry spoke on the topic, I'm gonna sit at the welcome table, the enduring power and promise of education as a public good. Tonight's lecture is entitled Lessons of Struggle from the Pioneering Generation to the Phoniest Movement. As Dr. Ngolunga will outline for us, this year we locate the lecture within Dube's leadership in protest, but also in community building, and how he and other intellectuals of his time would have handled today's challenges to students' life in higher education. As we once again reflect on Dube's legacy, we ponder the question, what can we learn from the intellectual and political culture, including protest, enabled by John Langalibalele Dube in addressing the elusive equity and quality in our higher education system. The organizing committee made up of myself, Sibusiso Masondo, Mangaliso Kumalo, Kumbulani Mgadi and Jabulo Manyoni, Oli Swazulu and Gonzo Mkize, invite you to sit back and enjoy tonight's lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both professors, to both my leaders. Now, when Prof was talking about the situation that we are faced with as far as how we are treating the girl child and the women in our society here in South Africa, in fact, I then remembered, it reminded me that in 1900, John Dube started what can be understood as the first school to be built by an individual for society. Schools that were there had been built by the missionaries, and very few schools were being built by the government, which was quite reluctant to build schools, especially for black people. But he built a school, and there were three unique emphases in that school. First one is that it was a school that was meant to develop the intellectual prowess of black people and to promote that they are able to think and become leaders like all other people, and to prove the fact that black people too were capable of understanding very complex scientific concepts and academic knowledge that was out there. That was the first unique contribution. The second unique contribution was that this was one school that was meant to educate black people from all ethnic backgrounds in South Africa. That's why it was called Ohlange. Kulapi inhlanga zazizofunda khona, zifundele khona. That's important. We shouldn't forget that. That was the unique thing at that time. It's a privilege now. People go to any school they want. That's not how things were in 1900. And to do that itself, it was a protest against all forms of segregation, including the emphasis on ethnicity, which was meant to divide black people. And he was subverting it by starting that school. Thirdly, the unique contribution was that he insisted, in a world where 1900 people didn't see education as important, even black people themselves, even for black boys. Others were not thinking that it's important that they must go to school. But he did not only open up for black boys, he insisted that girls must be admitted. I think that is important, especially for today. That's what Dube would emphasize to us. And he argued intentionally that both boys and girls would have to carry the responsibilities of running the schools. The same responsibilities, which was cleaning, which was cooking, even doing domestic science and knitting and all sorts of courses that were being offered. There was nothing that was reserved for girls and another reserved for boys. So he was quite ahead. And had we listened and learned from him, maybe the challenges that we have today would not be having them. Well, it's time for entertainment. A musical item will come to us from our partners, EDUT. They are not just guests who are invited to perform today. They are not just here as performers. They are partners. They've partnered with us in this lecture, at least for the past 5 years. They've always come to participate here, and we always look forward. Again, it's another avenue of collaboration that this lecture has put into practice. So it's your turn, good friends. You can come forward to perform. And then soon after that, we will introduce our guest speaker. So now we are introducing our guest speaker, with whom we are very pleased. We are honored to have in our midst, and somebody who's going to be speaking to us today. That's Dr. Bongani Ngulunga. He's the director of the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Studies, which is based at the University of Johannesburg. He holds a PhD from Brown University in the US, and is also a proud graduate from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. The other story about the University of KwaZulu-Natal is that he did not only leave with a degree, he also found a wife, a partner from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. So these kinds of communities are quite functional and helpful in other ways too. And we celebrate that. He's the author of the marvelous book titled The Man Who Founded the ANC, a biography of Pixley Kaisaga Sene, which won South Africa's most prestigious literary prize in 2018 from the Alan Pepin Award, and was also chosen as the best nonfiction monograph at the Humanities and Social Sciences Award in 2019. Ngulunga's professional experience extends to government, where he worked in the presidency of the Republic of South Africa for over a decade. In his youth, he led student struggles, including as a member of the Student Representative Council at UKZN. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome Dr. Ngulunga in our midst.
Program Director, Professor Khumalo, I have to say, when I was preparing for this lecture, I read your wonderful biography of Mafukuzela. Well, in addition to many writings that we have done, Deputy Vice Chancellor and Head of the College of Humanities, Professor Nhlanhla Mkhize, former Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Mazibuko, deans and heads of departments, especially the two deans that we have here today, the Dube family, Langa Dube in particular. Now he and I come a long way. Now what I didn't know is that he is married to Kamajola, my sister. Now I told him that it means then our friendship is permanent. If you have taken my sister, then you cannot run away from me. Professor Moletsane and members of the organizing committee, and in the case of Professor Moletsane, I don't know how many of your writings I've read. When I was a student here at the university, I don't know how many times, especially Professor Jonathan Johnson asked us to read your work. So it's quite a privilege today that I'm giving a lecture that we were central in organizing. Fellow academics, and you know, it gives me pleasure to say fellow academics. For a long time, I was a bureaucrat, and bureaucrats are not people who are looked at kindly. Now I can say fellow academics and feel quite proud. I also have to acknowledge the members of UCCSA. I don't think that we can talk about Reverend John Langalibalele Dube without talking about the Congregational Church. I don't even think you can talk about Inanda without talking about the Congregational Church. And so I am very privileged today that they are here to listen to the lecture. Leaders of students, I was once a leader of students, and I'll reflect a bit about that, especially at this university. Ladies and gentlemen, today is a special day for me. Over 2 decades ago, I came to this university as a teenager from rural Mahlabatini to study for my first degree. Like a stranger in a foreign land, I did not know even a single soul at this university. But by the time I left the university, having studied at its Westville and Howard College campuses, and with 3 degrees, I have to say, I left with fond memories and a lot more. From here, I met a very beautiful woman who later agreed to become my wife. I do not know why. and the mother to our children. Therefore, the University of KwaZulu-Natal represents more than an institution of higher learning and scholarship for me. It is a place where you get your lifelong mate. And I'm proof, for any person who's a student here, and if you find it difficult sometimes, know that you might just be lucky and find your lifelong mate like I did. I feel deeply honored and privileged to have been invited to deliver the John Langalibalele Dube lecture this year. And I'm especially thrilled that I'm giving the lecture this year, which is a very important year in the history of our country. A century ago, 4 extraordinary black literary giants were born. They are Eskia Mphahlele, Noni Jabavu, Peter Abrahams, and Sbusiso Nyembezi. Individually and collectively, these literary icons produce work that stirred the bonds of our common humanity and made us laugh, reflect, cry, and look at ourselves anew. Considering that we are not so far from Pietermaritzburg this evening, I should mention that Sbusiso Nyembezi's novel, Inkinsela yaseMgungundlovu, still gives me great laughter and joy every time I read it. Who can ever forget Sisi Ndebenkulu, Isquire? Now, I mentioned the centenary of these 4 literary giants, program director, because we tend to forget those who made tremendous contributions in the field of arts and culture or in other aspects of life other than politics. So during the course of this year, the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study has been hosting lectures and seminars to reflect on the literary contributions of the 4 centenarians. But it is also fitting that we recognize them during this lecture this evening, because, Program Director, you remember that we are celebrating Mafuguzela's life, and too often we forget that Mafuguzela was more than a political leader. He was also a novelist, an essayist, and a poet. In fact, my first introduction into Zulu history and the role of Shaka Kasenza was through reading Dube's historical novel, Insila Kashaka. Although I read the novel long time ago, I still remember the main character in the novel, Ujeka, Shaka's body servant. Dube's vivid description of KwaDukuza, the king's royal crawl, and the machinations of palace politics fascinated me greatly. And maybe that is the reason why I ended up working in the presidency. And in a sense, I became a bit of Ujeka myself as a spokesperson to the former president. Now, Program Director, John Langalibalele Dube was a man of extraordinary character and unrivaled achievement. What is often talked about, understandably and justly, is Mafuguzela's many roles as the political leader of his people. Having started at the turn of the 19th century, when he and his colleagues established the Natal Native Congress in 1900, Dube went on to have a distinguished political career. For 4 decades, beginning from the year 1900, he was involved in every major political initiative that was sought to bring about black political unity and advancement. He alone carries the distinction of having been elected as the President General of the ANC while he was not at the conference. Now, if you want to be president of the ANC today, you have to be there and count whether you still have the votes that were promised before. But in the case of Mafuguzela, he was not even there when he was elected first president of the ANC in 1912. But what that demonstrated was the esteem and confidence that his contemporaries had in him. But However, Mafukuzela was more than a politician. As I have said, he was a prolific essayist, a novelist, and poet. He was a farmer and entrepreneur. He was a missionary and a pastor to his congregation. He was an educationist. He was a civic leader and a community builder. He was an advisor and confidant to kings and queens. For many of us, it will take us a lifetime just to do one of the things that Mafukuzela achieved. To try to speak about his achievements will take us the whole night and more. What I do wish to mention tonight are just two major initiatives that he and his wife, Nokutela, worked together on. The first, as the program director indicated, was the school called Ohlange Institute, which the Dubes founded in 1900 after their stay in the United States of America. And they were influenced by an African American called Booker T. Washington. Although John Dube alone is often credited with the establishment of Ohlange Institute, which is now known as Ohlange High School, the historical record shows that Nokutela's contribution was as immense as Mafukuzela's. And I think it is very important that we recognize her for the role that she played. It is a tribute to their exceptional foresight that this school, which was the first to be established by black people, still stands today. The second initiative that both of them worked on together that I want to speak about tonight is, of course, the establishment of Langalibalele newspaper, which they did in April 1903. Beginning from humble beginnings, Ilanga grew up to be one of the most influential newspapers in Natal and South Africa as a whole. In fact, the Dubes often wrote the stories themselves with the assistance of students from Ohlange High School, who pitched in with the actual production of the paper. Now, I don't know how many of you have read the first issue of Langalibalele on the 6th of April, 1903. I have read every single issue of Langalibalele from April 1903 to 1961. Every single issue. Now, no, it's not because I like torture. It's because of a book project that I'm working on about AWG champion, also from Inanda, that has forced me to read the newspaper. And by the way, the paper used to be written in isiZulu, in English, and in Sesotho. For many years, you had those three languages, because even though the paper was done in KwaZulu-Natal, the target audience went beyond the people who lived in Natal and KwaZulu. I have singled out these two institutions, that is Ohlange High School as well as Langalibalele, because they both demonstrate the depth of Dube's vision and the influence his endeavors continue to have over many generations after he started these institutions over 100 years ago. Program director, I have called the generation to which Dube belonged a pioneering generation. Among his contemporaries were exceptional men and women, such as Charlotte Manye Maxeke, who was born in April 1871, just 2 months after Dube's birthday. Like Dube, she spent some time in Ohio studying at Wilberforce University. When she graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in 1901, Maxeke became the first black woman in South Africa to earn a university degree. She rose to become one of the outstanding leaders of her generation, occupying prominent roles in politics, education, the church, social work, and many other areas. And like Dube and other members of her generation, Maxeke valued education so much that she also established a school called Wilberforce Community College in Everton in Gauteng. She was also a pioneering leader in her own right, founding what we know today as the ANC Women's League. So outstanding was Maxeke as a leader that her former professor at Wilberforce University, W.E.B. Du Bois, the preeminent African-American intellectual and one of the founders of Pan-Africanism, was moved to write a tribute in 1930. He said about Maxeke, and I quote, "I regard Mrs. Maxeke as a pioneer in one of the greatest of human causes, working under extraordinary difficult circumstances to lead a people in the face of prejudice, not only against her race, but against her sex. To fight not only simply the natural and inherent difficulties of education and social uplift, but to fight with little money and little outside aid was indeed a tremendous task." I think that what Mrs. Maxeke has accomplished should encourage all men, and especially those of African descent. And in addition to that, it should inspire the white residents of South Africa and America to revise hastily made judgments concerning the possibilities of the Negro race. I've gone into some detail speaking about Mafukuzela's contemporary, Charlotte Maxeke, partly because I've been, like many people, greatly disturbed by the violence against women that has been taking place in our society. I know that in most instances, when people write history, they tend to write out women from history. But here are two cases of extraordinary women, Nokutela Dube, as well as Charlotte Maxeke, who were just not there to support their husbands, but who were visionaries in their own right and established institutions in their own rights. And I think we need to remind ourselves and again that what South Africa is today is largely because of the tremendous contribution that women of this country have made in building it. Joining Maxeke as Dube's contemporaries were other outstanding men and women, such as Solomon Plaki, Walter Khubusana, DDT Jabavu, KT Makanya, Silope Tema, Pixley Isagaseme, Sefako Mahato, just to mention it too, and I thought I should mention these names, because any one of them, let's read them: Solomon Plaki, Walter Khubusana, DDT Jabavu, KT Makanya, Silope Tema, Pixley Isagaseme, Sefako Mahato. Those names, I mean, that is a human representation of brilliance, each and every one of them today. And I think, as I'll mention it in this lecture, we need to remember them, especially at a time where black excellence sometimes doesn't find the expression that I think it deserves. We usually remember members of this generation for their individual and collective roles. However, it is important to mention that there is a lot more that united them. Their public lives were anchored on certain moral and political beliefs. Born in the second half of the 19th century and coming of age in the beginning of the 20th century, these men, and they were mostly men, we have to admit, and women, believed in political equality for all races. They held tight to the lesson they learned from the mission societies from which most of them were bred, which proclaimed that all human beings were children of God and were made in his image. It should not be surprising, therefore, that most of them shared a deep, abiding faith, which was a foundation of their private and public lives. We should also not be surprised that some of the prominent leaders of the ANC were ordained priests, including Dube himself, who was an ordained priest, including Reverend Mahabane, who was the fourth president of the ANC, was an ordained priest, including Luthuli, who was also an ordained priest. I can go on and on and on. But it shows the role of the church in the making both of the ANC and in the making of this society. Leading figures of the pioneering generation also believed in the transformative power of education in its broadest sense. Highly educated in their own right, some of them, such as Dube, Makgatu, Maxeke, Jabavu, Sem, and Xuma, to mention a few, were educated at universities overseas, and they labored to build institutions of learning so that generations after them could benefit from the transformative power of education. They also started newspapers, as we've mentioned in the case of Dube, who started Langalibalele. And these papers, they started against all odds because they wanted to educate black people about their rights and to encourage them to improve themselves. So the role of newspapers as a source of civic and moral education is most evident in the early years of Langalibalele, which regularly carried editorials in which Dube issued these exhortations. I mean, his most favorite was Vukani Bantu, Kapelani Bantu. I wish he was here today to say to us, Vukani Bantu, Kapelani Bantu, given the ills that we find in our society today. Their faith in the fairness and justice of the British Empire led them to knock on its doors every time they felt the government of the Union of South Africa treated them unjustly. Couched in respectful tones, their demands for social and racial equality always proclaimed their loyalty to the British Empire. Like good students they had been, they believed that persuasive argument should win the day. Time and again, their faith was betrayed. It was betrayed in 1909 when they sent a delegation to England to plead for equal rights under the Union of South Africa that was being negotiated. Their pleas for empire's intervention against the Native Lands Act was betrayed. As we recall, John Langalibalele Dube led a delegation in 1914 asking the imperial government to appoint a commission of inquiry to investigate the issue of the Natives Land Act. That was more than 100 years before the Zondo Commission, I have to say. When the First World War broke out in 1914, they suspended all their protests against the Natives Land Act and other laws. In fact, leading figures in the ANC traveled the length and breadth of this country, mobilizing black people to serve in the Great War on the side of empire. Among those who joined the war were men who perished when the SS Mendi sank on the British Isles. Their support and participation in the war, therefore, did not gain them any favors from the British Empire. When the war ended in November 1918, the ANC called a special conference. And one of the resolutions of that conference was that they should send another delegation to England in 1919. Basically, they were saying, we have proved our loyalty to the British Empire. Let us go back and plead for our results. And again, they came back empty-handed. The empire chose to listen to the explanation of the South African government of the time, rather than to the pleas and arguments of its loyal black subjects. Looking back 100 years after the 1919 delegation, I think it is in fact better that the delegation did not succeed, because the failure became a turning point in the struggle for emancipation in South Africa. The major lesson Dube's generation learned from that failure of the 1909, 1914, and 1919 delegations was that the struggle for emancipation could not and would not be won by sending petitions to England. It had to be fought and won here at home. That was one of the major lessons they learned. But even then, their efforts here at home did not result to the political change they had worked so hard to bring about. If anything, the regime of white domination became bold and intransigent, terminating the Cape Black franchise in 1936 and ultimately introducing apartheid in 1948. Defeated and disillusioned, leading figures of the Dube generation exited the political stage. For some of them, the cycle of life knocked on the door and they departed this earth having failed to bring the emancipation to the people that they led. For Mafukuzela, a burning light that had brightened the African sky was extinguished on 11th February 1946, when he passed on to the land of his ancestors. Others, such as Pixley Sagaseme and Sefako Makhato, survived Dube by a few years longer, only departing in 1951. In their place entered a new generation of political leaders, who included Anton Lembede, Albertina Sisulu, Ellen Kuzwayo, A.P. Mda, Dan Klume, Mxolisi Majombosi, William Komo, Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, Joe Matthews, Walter Sulu, and many more. The new generation of leaders learned a major lesson from the struggles of their predecessors, which was that polite pleas for freedom in the face of oppression do not work. In the place of deputations and petitions, the new generation ushered new forms of protest, which were assertive, direct, and less reverential. Unlike their forebears in the pioneering generation, they did not plead for freedom as loyal members of the empire, but they demanded it as their birthright. This generation of leaders was prepared to make every sacrifice to win freedom for the people that it led. Mandela's statement in the dock, when he declared his willingness to pay the ultimate sacrifice for the cause of freedom, captured the dominant sentiment of a generation. It was this generation and successive one who followed it that finally battled and won the freedom that the pioneering generation had started in 1900, in 1912. So, as we reflect on the trials, tribulations, and indeed failures of the struggles of the pioneering generation, I think there are some major lessons that we need to learn from their public lives and see whether those lessons are relevant today. And for this lecture, I would like to focus just on three. As I mentioned earlier on, some of its leading figures, people like Dube, belong to a class of the most educated and intelligent people, not only here in South Africa, but in the whole world. Dube was, of course, was one of them. Others included medical doctors such as William Anderson Soga, Theo Soga's son, who studied and qualified in medicine from Glasgow in 1883. There was John Mavuma Nembula from here in Natal, who studied and qualified in medicine from the University of Chicago in 1887. There was Abdullah Abdurrahman, who graduated in Scotland in 1893. There was James Moroka and Albert Xuma, the 6th and 7th ANC presidents respectively, who were also medical doctors. They were followed by other figures like Silas Molema, who graduated with a medical degree from Glasgow in 1919. Others were lawyers. Think of Alfred Mangena, who was the first black lawyer in 1910, who was followed by Pixley Sagaseme, another lawyer, who was also followed by Richard Msimang from Edendale, another lawyer, who was followed by George Monsiwa, another lawyer from the place that we call Limpopo today, who was followed by Ngubu Poswayo from Engobo in the Eastern Cape, another brilliant lawyer. So the idea that black people are not educated is quite extraordinary. We are talking about people who qualified as medical doctors in the 1800s, people who were lawyers in the early 1900s, distinguished men and women. So, but what this emphasizes to me is the value that the pioneering generation attached to education. They thought of education as fundamental to the responsibility of leadership. So valued was education and university qualifications in particular, that it was common practice at the time that if you wrote a letter to the editor of a newspaper to put your degree after your name. So it will be Bongani Ngolunga, PhD. That sounds nice. Now, I'm not suggesting, Program Director, that we should start mentioning our university degrees every time we send a letter to the editor of Iselwezwe. The point that I'm making is that we should reflect seriously about the dangers of a political culture that does not value the importance and centrality of education in political leadership. In a world that is increasingly becoming complex, the value of education has never been so important. Unfortunately, there have been moments in the long century of political struggle when we have not valued education as much as we should have done so. There was a moment, especially in the 1980s, I have to say, when we said liberation now, education later. We are reaping the consequences of that today. Lest I be misunderstood, this is not an argument for preserving positions of political responsibility only for the educated. In a democracy, every person who so decides should be allowed to stand for political office. Yet, if freedom has to have a substantive meaning, we should take a leaf from Dube's generation and appreciate once again the transformative power of education. As our former President Nelson Mandela famously said, I quote, "Education is the great engine of personal development. It is through education that the daughter of a peasant can become a doctor, that the son of a mine worker can become the head of the mine, that the child of farm workers can become the president of a great nation." And should I add that a young boy from Mahlabathini can deliver the John Langalibalele Dube lecture. Program Director, the idea of leadership that Dube, Matlege, and their contemporaries espoused was extraordinary. They espoused and practiced an expansive view of leadership, which included not only making political demands on behalf of the people that you lead. They saw themselves as community builders whose responsibility was to build institutions that will benefit and oppress people that they led. They built schools and churches. They established newspapers to serve as sources of information, education, and debate. They formed companies that bought land for human settlement. We can go on and on and on. Some of the institutions they built over a century ago, as we see in the case of Mafuzela, still exist today. One of the institutions they were so instrumental in establishing was the University of Fort Hare, which turned 100 years ago in 2016. In fact, one of the people who was at the forefront of the establishment of the University of Fort Hare and became its first black professor was DDT Jabavu, who belonged to the pioneering generation. And that's the reason why we call them pioneers. They didn't follow, they led, they invented. Here in Durban are numerous institutions that were established by Fukuzela, as I have said, including Ilanga Natal and Ohlange High School. Don Tengo Jabavu and John Knox Bokwe in the Cape were instrumental in the establishment of Imvo Zabansundu, while Walter Khubusane and Tio Soka formed Izilabantu newspaper. In Kimberley, Solomon Plaque started Sale Abechwana. While in the Transvaal Seme started Abantu Bathu newspaper and bought farms in the Eastern Transvaal for the benefit of his people. As I have mentioned, Maxeke started Wilberforce Community College in Everton and was instrumental in the establishment of American Methodist Episcopal Church in South Africa. Leadership, therefore, as the art and ethic of building rather than destroying is one of the major lessons that we should all learn from Dube and his contemporaries. To be a leader is to build, not to destroy. The third and final lesson that I wish to touch on briefly concerns the immense value that Dube and his contemporaries attached to the role of reasoned argument, persuasion, and engaging with different views when we are involved in politics. That at the heart of politics is persuasion, is reasoned argument. They understood that when reason and persuasion disappears from politics, they are often replaced by intolerance for dissenting voices, and sometimes an extremism that divides rather than unites. Now, there was a moment in the long struggle for emancipation where reason and argument was replaced by the politics of the crowd, where the leader stands in front and says, "Long live," and doesn't engage in reason. The generation of Dube reasoned and argued. You know, I have to just mention this. If you look at the photos, even as late as 1990, say for instance at an ANC conference, people have ties on. Check the photos of the first conference when the ANC came back at the Durban Westville campus. Just check those photos, check each and every delegate and check what they are wearing. They have shirts, some of them have jackets, and some of them have ties. Now, there is a reason that was the case. I'm not saying you only argue when you have a tie. But it's because when they went to a conference, they knew they were going there to argue and try to persuade. But if you are not going to argue and persuade, there is really no, can you imagine, to hit a toy with a tie? I mean, that is quite an unusual sight to see. But the point that I'm trying to make is that when argument, reasoned argument and persuasion disappears, it is often replaced by intolerance for dissenting voices and sometimes extremism that divides rather than unites. Moving from this premise, Dube's generation cared deeply, not only about the ultimate goal of political struggle, but also about the means employed to attain that goal. The means did not justify the end. What mattered was both the goals as well as the means that were employed. In other words, they understood that a political struggle for emancipation could not be based legitimately on a political culture that undermined dissent and favored insult over reason and persuasion. Because sometimes in our politics, what is prominent is who can shout the loudest and who can insult the loudest. Not who can persuade, but who can insult. That is antithetical to the generation of Mafuguzela and his contemporaries. As I have said, I spent a great deal of time reading old newspapers as part of my academic work. That comes with its advantages and disadvantages, I have to say. What strikes me the most often is the culture of passionate debate that was predominant in the first half century of the struggle for emancipation. Newspapers were considered forums for informed debate and as platforms to advance arguments regarding the goals and means of political struggle. The view of politics as more than just an exercise of raw political power, but as an intellectual contestation over the means and ends of human emancipation was also held, interestingly, by the 1944 generation, the generation of Mandela, of Lembede. Time does not allow us to delve deeply into the intellectual contributions of the 1944 generation. Perhaps we should just take one moment to savor the intellectual depth of the contributions of one of its leading figures, Anton Lembede. Shortly before his unexpected and premature death in 1947, Lembede made a passionate argument for the establishment of an African Academy of Art and Sciences. And I thought I should mention this because I'm at the university. That in 1947, Anton Lembede was arguing for the establishment of an African Academy of Art and Sciences. In his argument, he said, "We need science to assist us in our present stage of transition, and we shall need it more increasingly thereafter." To the question, what knowledge is of most value? The uniform reply is science. It is science that will help us to adapt ourselves to the Western standards of life and to dispel the fogs of ignorance and superstition. Our art, he continued, including literature, can also receive a great impetus and fillip from a cultural society or an academy of art. We need artists to interpret to us and to the world our glorious past, our misery, suffering, and tribulation of the present time, our hopes, our aspirations, and our divine destiny and our great future, to inspire us with the message that there is hope for our race and that we ought therefore to draw plans and lay foundations for a longer future that we can imagine by struggling for national freedom, so as to save our race from imminent extinction and extermination. In short, we need African artists to interpret the spirit of Africa. I've quoted Lembede at length, Program Director, to demonstrate that for a long time, reasoned and persuasive argument was a cornerstone of political engagement in black political struggle. We should claim it. It is part of our tradition. Unfortunately, it is a tradition that has often been replaced by intolerance and the widespread of violence in pressing for civic and political demands. It is important to remind ourselves that resort to violent protest or the use of violence to pursue civic and political demands has not always a dominant feature of the politics of emancipation in South Africa. It is something new. Actually, when the African National Congress decided to embark on the armed struggle in 1960, it was after every means of peaceful protest had been shut down through repression and state violence. Even then, the proposal to form or the turn to organized violence, which was the establishment of Umkhonto, was subjected to spirited discussion and debate. In other words, the use of violence to pursue a political struggle was imposed on the liberation movement. It was a choice that was made after everything else had failed. In the specific case of the 1960 decision, the immediate context, if you remember, was the Sharpeville massacre on 21st March 1960. And organizations like the ANC and the PAC had been banned, which meant that every other means for peaceful protest had been shut down. So we have to remember every time when people resort to violence that it has never been part of our political culture. And even in moments when we have used violence, it's because we are left with no choice. Prior to the 1960 decision to form Umkhonto weSizwe, there have, of course, been periodic episodes of violence in black politics. We have to be honest. One violent outbreak actually occurred when Dube was still alive, and he was a dominant player in Durban politics. That episode took place in 1929, 90 years ago. In fact, I spent some time this morning at the Durban archives reading about it. When black workers in Durban decided to boycott beer halls, from which the municipality compelled them to buy umqombothi or sokam beer, there was something that was called a native revenue account. The Durban municipality had a monopoly of producing umqombothi because it didn't want to set aside money for black people because it said black people did not belong to Durban. So they said they will produce umqombothi and they will force black people to drink that umqombothi. So every black person had to go to beer halls. Now, then black women started moving into Durban and they started making umqombothi. Those people who were forced to drink umqombothi at beer halls then started to going to those black women who were making it. Then the municipality didn't like it and unleashed the state violence of the police. And there was a huge fight and people died. So when you walk down, it used to be called Smith Street. Is it Pixley Kasebe now? Know that people were forced to drink umqombothi in Durban. And by the way, and also forced to, they were dipped because there was a view that black people in the city of Durban had germs, so they were dipped by cows. So all of this led to the outbreak of violence that happened in 1929. The more tragic violent episode, of course, took place 70 years ago. That was the 1949 Pepin Riots, which pitted Africans against their Indian compatriots. The lesson that was learned, especially from the 1949 episode, was that we needed to forge closer political unity between Indians and Africans, especially in Durban. In the 1980s and early 1990s, there was widespread political violence, which mostly pitted black people against other black people. Even in this case, there was evidence that the state was directly and indirectly involved in perpetuating the violence. Unfortunately, the internecine violence of the 1980s and early 90s left a legacy in our political culture, which suggested that violent protest is a legitimate instrument for pursuing just political demands. From time to time, we have had to deal with this culture of intolerance of different political views and preferences, even in the democratic South Africa. I do not have to preach to you about the devastating consequences of the resort to violence as a means of getting one's way. We know those consequences too well here in this province of KwaZulu-Natal. At this point, Program Director, I believe I should confess to some of my sins. And I will not confess to all of them because that may take a long night, my wife knows. As some of you know, I served in the SRC of this university in the early 1990s. I led several protests, especially against the exclusion of students from poor families. Some of the protests turned violent and led to the destruction of university property. In preparing for this lecture, I've had to think seriously about the culture of protest in our country that often leads to conflict. I believe that it is a bitter inheritance from our past. This country was founded on an extremely unequal political and social order that required catastrophic levels of state-directed violence to enforce that order. Because of that, violence became a norm. In addition, the non-responsiveness of those who occupy position of authority pushed communities to resort to violence and the destruction of property to ensure that their pleas and demands were heard. This phenomenon, as I've said, gained currency in the 1980s. A popular challenge to the apartheid system became widespread. As it became more widespread, the state responded by unleashing violence. The call for making the country ungovernable, therefore, found fatal ground because the state in any event was illegitimate and had proven for a long time to be the enemy of the citizens it presided over. Unfortunately, the culture that emerged while fighting an illegitimate state has spilled over to the democratic era. It has become commonplace to witness violence and the destruction of property committed in the name of pursuing just and legitimate political causes. The intransigence and disregard for community needs that are often displayed by those in positions of authority inflame passions. So, Program Director, I wish to turn my attention to the contributions of the Phoniest movement as I conclude this lecture. There is absolutely no doubt that the issues that this generation of leaders have raised are legitimate and need to be addressed. At the heart of the politics of this generation is a correct observation, which is that the promise of freedom has not reached the majority of South Africans. The symbols and the socio-economic patterns of colonialism and apartheid remain largely intact. They ask the question, which I think is the relevant question: what is freedom then, if it excludes the majority of people, leaves them outside? What kind of freedom, what kind of emancipation is that? I think we have to take seriously the Phoniest movement's call also for the decolonization of South African universities, especially the decolonization of knowledge. I told one professor of sociology in Johannesburg that it is quite extraordinary that in South Africa, given our history of racism, we really do not have serious scholarship on race. That is quite extraordinary. I mean, if you think about Mafuzela himself, we have just started in the past few years to have people writing about him seriously. When I wrote Seme's book, it was really one of the first books written about him. How is it possible, in the case of Sem, that a young man who left South Africa when he was 14 years old, went to the United States, studied, went to Columbia University, went to Oxford, and came back, became the second black person to be admitted as an attorney, and at 30 years old, founded the ANC? How is it possible that not a single serious scholarly book had been written about him? Not a single serious scholarly book. Even in the case of Charlotte Maxeke that we are talking about, she still deserves a serious book about her. I can go on and on and on and on. That is the issue that the Phoniest movement have put on the agenda, that we do need the decolonization of knowledge. Before the Phoniest movement brought this matter forcefully to the fore, there was a general tendency to approach the transformation of universities in a narrow way. Transformation was limited to changing the faces, especially of university managers. If there was a black manager, the university was transformed. While this aspect is important, our experience demonstrates that appointing black people, I'm not referring to you, Professor Mkhize, appointing black people to leadership positions in universities does not transform a university. Well, UKZN is transformed. I know, I'm a graduate of this place. UKZN is, it has the youngest dean in the country, Professor Msebe. Come on, we have to give UKZN credit. I have to say, unfortunately, in certain instances, black people in positions of power hinder the project of transformation. They use our common experience of blackness to appeal for a defense of the status quo, or to call on those who demand fundamental change to move slowly. Asihambeni kancane, my comrade, they say. It is therefore right that the current generation of student activists has called on all of us to become bolder and to question our long-held beliefs regarding how a transformed society and a university ought to look like. This generation's demand for far-reaching change has also prompted me to think again about the contributions of the pioneering generation. Although Dube and his contemporaries long for a day in which all South Africans will enjoy the benefits of democratic citizenship and carry collectively its responsibilities, we have to admit that their approach was gradual. They believe that it will take a long time to reach the destination of a democratic South Africa. Because of this gradual approach, some scholars sometimes accuse leading figures of this generation of having been conservative. However, I want to make this point. We have to judge the contributions of Dube and his contemporaries in their context. The South Africa of 1900 was a completely different country than the South Africa of 2019. Moreover, we have to keep in mind always that human progress is a collective intergenerational undertaking. It is like participating in a relay race. One generation makes its contributions to the best of its abilities. It then passes the baton to the next generation. A generation to which a baton has been passed does not start by demolishing that which its predecessors have achieved. It builds on it. And once it has also made its contributions, it then passes on the baton to its successors. Thus, it is as it should be that the generation of Lembede, Mdali, Liengoi, Mandela, Annie Selinga, Francis Bart, Fatima Mia, to mention a few, did not destroy the foundation that Dube, Plaki, Seme, Beta Mkhize had laid. It built on it. And the successors to the Mandela generation, those men and women, have you not found it curious actually that the leaders who followed Mandela, most of them were born the same year in 1942. I'll give you the names. Thabo Mbeki in 1942, Jacob Zuma 1942, Chris Hani 1942, Zola Skoia 1942, Charles Nabula 1942. Well, it's only Steve Biko who was born in 1946. But that generation that succeeded also, the Mandela generation, did not demolish or destroy what Mandela and his contemporaries had built. They've built on it and they have to pass the baton to the next generation. I make this point about leadership being like running a relay race because there's a little bit of a message that I want to give with humility to the Phoniest movement. So I wish to emphasize the point that I made at the beginning, that we should all work together to remove from our politics a tendency to resort to violence and the destruction of property that often accompanies legitimate struggles for fundamental transformation. It is unwise to ban the library because we are unhappy about something that university managers have done or are doing. Fight for what you believe should be done, without a doubt. But do not destroy that which you'll need once the good fight has been won. There is a saying in Zulu, you'll forgive me, the language is a bit rough. We say in Zulu, ungasnyeli isihlahla. That is what we say in Zulu. We say ungasnyeli isihlahla. I do not know how do you translate that in English, but I think in English they say you must not cut your nose to spite your face. I think it's better that way. Let's not go to ungasnyeli isihlahla. Let's not go to ungasnyeli isihlahla. But really, I think that is really a profound, by the way, profound observation. That if you are unhappy with what is going on at the university, then you go and ban the library or a lecture hall. So once you have won, then where are you going to go? because we still have to go to the library, but we have banned it. So in other words, so you cannot go and hide underneath the tree because we have left whatever we have left there. So I think it is important then that we should engender a new political culture which encourages citizens to challenge injustice and unaccountable social and political power, while at the same time respecting and protecting the resources and infrastructure we all need to make progress. Because we need these resources and infrastructure to make progress. Young leaders, particularly those who are at institutions of higher learning, should play a leading role in developing and nurturing this new political culture. As I have said, banning a lecture hall does not a revolutionary make. We are an arsonist, not a revolutionary if you ban a library. There also has to be a fundamental change of attitude from those who occupy positions of power and authority. There's a general sense of complacency that develops when those who are in leadership positions are elected or appointed to those positions. Although most of them campaign for the positions on platforms of radical change, once they are put into those positions, they change their tune. That should change. The social crisis that we face in South Africa today demands responsive, caring, and bold leadership. This is true for universities as it is true for the broader society. I just want to say, really in conclusion, the struggle for political and economic emancipation has been long and hard. It took more than 100 years. To take this struggle to the next phase requires that we all look carefully at the journey we have all traveled. The struggles the pioneering generation started at the beginning of the 20th century provide instructive lessons from which we need to learn. However, the responsibility for bringing about the next phase of freedom lies with the next generation of political activists. It is up to them now to take forward this struggle without destroying the foundations that have been built. This is the major lesson that we should take from Mafuguzela and his contemporaries. They did not just complain and protest. They also built institutions of education, platforms of debate and information, and spaces of community development and sanctuary. We need to follow their example. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much to our guest speaker. That was really profound and highly appreciated. That journey to history and coming back to our current context has helped us to be able to look at what is happening today from different perspectives, learning from those who went before us. In fact, as Gustavo Gutierrez would have said, today we've just taken a drink from our own wells. And thank you for that. Now, we are going to engage our guest speaker, but before that, we are going to have Unlocked Keys coming forward to do their thing, so that after that, once you've reflected and we've taken in what our speaker has given to us, we can then engage him. Unlocked Keys, can you come and be unlocked?
Ninjan, come on, this was a good lecture. I've never attended one, but I think I'm going to try and attend it. Siyabong. This is Usbusiso Mashilwane. He's a pianist, a jazz pianist, and he has 2 albums. So if you can check him out on iTunes, on all the musical 2 albums. Yes. He was nominated for a summer this year. So he's done well. And my name is Ulwazi. I'm just backing.
Well, some things sounds easy. You can think you can just come here and say, hey, yee-haw. Lots of work has gone to that. It's not that easy. We'll take this opportunity to ask the Dean and Head of School of the School of Education, Ubaba Undlondo, to come forward as Opendula. Thank you.
Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Untitled Chapter, our guest speaker today, Dr. Ngulunga, the Dube family, the former Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Figile Mazubugo, and of course, my colleague, Professor Sparrett, and your partner. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Wow, what an incredible, incredible lecture by Dr. Ngulunga. Today, I found the engagements most profound, most informative, and your trace, the historical trace that you provided, quite informative and quite nuanced, because very rarely do we ever engage in such lectures that expose the nature of history in bringing about the present moment. I was reflecting actually about my own upbringing as a young man from Escort, and I was thinking about when I was starting off in Zola Primary School, we used to have this incredible text written in isiZulu that allowed us to imagine and to think in multiple ways that allowed us to engage with who we are as a people. But often, when I got to high school, which was a former Model C high school, all of that went out of the window. I started learning Shakespeare and learning all the other literary forms that are external to the continent of Africa. And I was quite touched and amazed by the fact that you guys are already engaging in a project of such seriousness as is looking at our own literary writers and engaging with them in substantive ways. What I found incredible with your lecture is the way in which you engage with a generational analysis of what each of these pioneers, individuals who are visionaries, brought to the South African context that we find today. I thought your message around violence was a critical one, because very often in higher education, we're confronted with a new machinery that demands. And if you do not respond to this new machinery, you find yourself burning outside there, or the building's burning. So I thought very much that the message that came across around critically engaging with what these pioneers contributed to our social fiber was absolutely critical. The notion of prioritizing education, the notion of servant leadership, pioneering leadership, of seasoned argumentation, it was something that I thought was pivotal and quite marvelous to engage with. Now, I thought also the engagement of violence as an inherited bitter, you called it at some point, a bitter inheritance from the past was something that I thought was very much on point. Very often we tend to assume that violence as we see today is a reflection of our own society. And I was actually quite thinking about the response to the Constitutional Court's decision to ban spanking, I beg your pardon, at home. And the response has immediately been, oh no, you are killing us and destroying us. But actually, have we paused for a moment to ask ourselves, how have we come to learn that violence is normal as a society? That it is okay to beat up a child? It's part of a colonial machinery, an apartheid machinery that actually allowed us to think that it was legitimate, that it was fine, and it was acceptable. I mean, we read it, spare the child. I mean, what is it? Spare the rod, spoil the child, isn't it? Isn't that the fundamental core of missionary education? And of course, we have assumed that this takes premise and in fact is central to who we are as a people, when in fact it is not. So I thought that was quite powerful when you raise it. Now, Dr. Ngulunga, the response that we often get in higher education from our student leaders often is that Frantz Fanon advocated violence, and if it is pursued for a revolutionary cause. We hear it time and time again. What you've given us today, I think, is an opportunity to ask ourselves a deeper question. When is it appropriate to use violence? And what I'm getting from your talk is that violence is only ever legitimate after everything has been exhausted. And of course, it is about responding to the master's tools. So the very same violence, if you think about the apartheid regime and what you are flagging, it was because the master himself was using violence to kill and oppress our people. Now, a fundamental question is, can we use violence against a democratic government or society? I don't think think we can, but I think you've already offered us a way there of thinking about this. The students often argue that the higher education institutions, by their very nature, are fundamentally racist. They would argue that the system itself is oppressive and violent. And they would argue that because it is so violent, we should then deploy the tools of the master to speak to the violence that is embedded in our colonial system. But I think what you've said is actually no. You've said that the very response of using violence undermines the very project of a revolution that students are trying to pursue. You've said that the machinery that we have, albeit now black, may of course be racist and may of course advance certain racist ends, but if we pursue a violent agenda, we undermine the very revolution we're trying to pursue. So I was thinking about one of the key feminist thinkers, a black feminist scholar, Audre Lorde's notion of the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, right? I was thinking as I was reflecting that you had noted, for example, and I'm sorry I'm not wearing a tie. You had noted that the Dube generation tried to speak the language of the master. But to some extent, the language of the master could not work. Equally so, if we look at even the Mandela generation that you've discussed and the decision to adopt violent means, we know, for example, that violence alone did not win the freedom that we now have. That in fact, it's the very reason why Mandela now is called a sellout, because he adopted other means alongside the tools, I keep on dropping this, the tools of the master in order to advance his the cause. So I am touched by what you are saying, because what you are offering us, and I wonder then in higher education, if we cannot use the master's tools to break down the master's house, what tools do we have at our disposal when the very machinery is fundamentally racist and fundamentally oppressive to students and to those of us who occupy higher education? I wonder also whether is there a space for indigenous knowledge systems within such engagement with the master's tools or with the machinery that exists. I'm wondering also whether we need to pause for a moment and re-educate our students in higher education spaces. But in so doing, I'm wondering whether we have the human resources to do the very re-education that you talk about. So who is it that teaches and that occupies higher education spaces, and what do they know? So is what they know then going to give us these tools to undo the oppression? I wonder. So the one dimension also that you bring up in your work is the complexity of human nature. So you speak of Dube himself, and you note that in fact it wasn't necessarily that he was a conservative, but the society at the time reflected particular ways of behavior, and it was because of that there were certain actions and behaviors on his part. But I wonder, you flagged the role of women in the liberation movement. I wonder whether we are sufficiently, as liberation scholars, as the academy, thinking about the role that women have played insofar as bringing about liberation with the aim of actually doing and addressing the gender-based violence and the femicide that we see in society today. So in other words, are we not pulling women a bit too much to the back and not too much to the front? And is that not allowing space for patriarchy to assume a particular dominant position in our liberation narrative? As I sit down finally, Dr. Ngulunga, I wonder, and you'll forgive me if I pose this question to you in this way. I'm wondering whether you're not giving too much credit to the post-Mandela generation on whether they were able to hand the baton to the next generation. And I wonder whether what we are seeing in higher education spaces and in society today, not a reflection of the failure for that generation to be able to hand out the baton to the generation that it was given the baton. Also, I'm asking in this question, with these calls and actions that we see in higher education happening presently in our spaces, I am wondering whether these calls are in fact legitimately within higher education. I wonder what role external parties are playing in shaping the discourses that we see playing themselves out in higher education today. And I'm also wondering whether the demands that we see from students are legitimately, honestly, from students, by students, or is there something more to pay attention to? In other words, do you not think that the master has found new ways of working? Thank you.
Academics end their living by confusing society. So you've done well, my brothers, both of you. Thank you so much. Well, they help us to think and reflect genuinely on the issues that we face as society. So now is the time for us to engage with our speakers. And we only have 10 minutes. We can stretch it to 15, but we'll try and stick within 10 minutes, which means we'll have 2 rounds. The first round for 5 questions, and then Dr. Ngolunga will respond, and then we'll have another round for another 5 hands, and then we'll be done after that, okay? We can't solve the problems of the world only today and in this session. Okay, let's have questions. Okay, I think we need a chair at the front here for Dr. Ngolunga to come and sit here and see the people who are going to be engaging him. I've got a hand there and I have got a hand here.
I'm going to start with a person who can't respond now, Prof. Msibi, and say I would like you to organize a symposium on the Constitutional Court judgment on spanking, because there might just be an enforcement of Eurocentric parenting values in a society that is not in sync with them. And there is an ideological debate, not a legal debate going on there. And I'll deal with it in another time, but create that forum. Dr. Ngolunga, I want to end off where Prof. Msibi was at, but I won't put you under pressure about the 1942 you served, but simply safe to say, don't you think what is happening now, if you go to Nkgopotse Tiro's Terfluep testimony, 1972, he speaks about what would be the value of education to black graduates. And he says our duty as black graduates is to go back to our leaders and educate them, because they've become part of the bolts that sustain the system of oppression. That's what Nkgopotse Tiro, as a 24-year-old, if I'm not mistaken, 2 years before his death, says. Don't you think that part of the problem that we have today is a generation that refuses to become irrelevant and thus does very good work in co-opting the younger generation? Forget about the master for a minute. Let's deal with ourselves as black people. Is the old generation among black people giving younger people? When you look, for example, at how the phenomenon of the Youth League has been abused within the African National Congress today, when you say a 30-year-old was a founder of the ANC, I can tell you today without a blink in my ear, or my eye, rather. Well, if my ear blinked, I'd be shut and not listen. So. That a 30-year-old in the ANC today can never be considered for the top 6 position in the ANC. Never. Isn't that tragic? And don't you think, so what do you think about the politics of co-option and co-optation of young people by the older generation currently? The second question I want to ask is, can a democratically elected government become justifiably illegitimate and force people into means of revolution that fall outside the prescripts of the Constitution because the very government that leads now acts ex parte to the very Constitution that it has sworn to? Thank you.
My name is Fe Ruzi. I'm a Phoniest and anarchist. Your presentation, sir, is a really continuation of the reflection of our society without looking at state formation. Because we are looking at all of these things happening within a state, which is not a product of indigenous people. Can the debate start from the formation of the state while we are talking and reflecting from all the contribution that happened within all the generation? And literature tells us that each generation may decide to choose tools of analysis, which Professor Musibi raised, and with the name Fanon, which I was supposed also to rise. But I'm going to just stick on a chapter, the pitfalls of national consciousness. Is it the reflection of what is currently happening? And did we just change the state? Are these universities the product of indigenous need? Looking to what Babu Dube did, to build a school to respond to the need of indigenous people. Were these universities built to respond to the need of indigenous people? How can we transform them? I think I'm still an anarchist. Thank you so very much.
Thank you much. Okay, we had a hand that side, yes.
My question is, how do you actually bridge the gap between the pioneer generation as well as the modern day or the so-called born-free generation? Because what I've noticed is with the born-free generation, they are currently facing, frustrations which were actually taking place in the transition of democracy. And how do we actually ensure that they become the intellectuals that Dr. Dube as well as the other founders of the ANC had become in their times? Thanks.
I think it is better if I stand here, partly because this could serve as protection from anarchists. Because we know what anarchy does. It's very unpredictable. So it's better if I have somewhere to hide. No, I want to start by thanking all of you for the questions, and perhaps starting with Professor Tom Sibi. Let's deal with Fanon, because there is a friend of mine who's in the audience and said you are going to be addressing Phoniest. They are going to tell you about Fanon. So you may as well preempt them and include it in the speech. I said I'm not going to do so. I'll wait for the question. But Fanon never argued for gratuitous violence. I mean, if somebody can show me where Fanon argued for gratuitous violence, then I will surrender. He didn't. He was talking about violence in the context of colonial subjugation and the role that violence could play in overthrowing colonialism. I mean, there are moments where he said it could be cathartic. We have to accept that, but cathartic in the context of colonial subjugation. I think that is a very important point to underscore, because it brings us to the use of violence when there are democratic spaces to express your point of view. Because as I said in the lecture, I mean, if you go back to a moment where, say, the liberation movement took a decision to resort to violence, there was a particular context to it. That all the other avenues of peaceful protest had been closed. And it was not only that. I mean, the state had decided to use violence against people who were pursuing a struggle peacefully. And the immediate moment at the time was Sharpeville in 21st March 1960. But not just only Sharpeville. Immediately after Sharpeville, it was the banning of the liberation movements, including the ANC and the PAC. So there was a question then. In the context where the state has banned the liberation movements and has turned its arms against the defenseless people, what do you do? But there's something quite extraordinary about that moment, that even though the conditions were clearly pointing towards the armed struggle, that decision was not taken lightly. One of the greatest sons, not only of South Africa, but of the African continent, Luthuli, it took quite a lot of convincing him, even at that moment when every avenue had been closed, whether violence could be used. I think the question that we have to answer is that where citizens in a democratic society with all its imperfections, where people can vote, where people can protest, people can sit in, is there a situation where it is allowed that you can use violence to pursue your goal? Does it not even undermine the legitimacy of the goal that you are pursuing if you resort to violence when there are other options? Because really, I think that goes to the core of the issue here. I cannot think, I don't know, maybe it's because I'm an academic and maybe because the education came so difficult for me. I was the first generation, or the first person in my family to go to university. Now, when I came to the University of KwaZulu-Natal and went to a library, I had never seen so many books in my life, and I didn't know where to start. And to me, really, that was the equivalent of paradise. I cannot imagine it. Under what circumstances it would be acceptable for somebody to burn down like hundreds of thousands of books under the justification that you are pursuing a legitimate struggle. Maybe I've become too old. As I said, I came to the university over 2 decades ago. My first degree was 23 years ago from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, so that is old. I belong to a different generation. But I read history, as I said, perhaps more than most people. I cannot think of instances where, for instance, a burning of a library is ever justified. That does not mean that what is contained in those books in the library I agree with. But that is an invitation for argument, for disagreement. That's the reason why I'm a scholar. If you write something that I think doesn't make sense, I write something else and respond to you. That's how we make progress, especially as scholars. So to me, the idea that violence, gratuitous violence, under any circumstances is acceptable, I just cannot understand it. And I mean, those who pursue that cause, they shouldn't pursue it in Fanon's name, because that was not Fanon's argument. We can go back to Fanon, all of us. We are graduates and students of the University of KwaZulu-Natal, so it should be acceptable to debate. That's what this university is about. But Fanon never made that argument. The argument that he made, it was under the context of colonialism. He never said in a democratic society, you can just gratuitously pursue violence. That is a point that I want to make. I want to talk about the 1942 generation. By the way, if you look at the speech, I talk about Dube, I talk about Mandela, then I get to the 1942 generation, I put a full stop. There was a reason why I put a full stop, because it gets a little bit complicated. It is true that a lot of mistakes have been made. And those mistakes, even by the let's call them the 1942 generation, right? The professor argues that they do not want to hand over the baton to the next generation. But the baton, in a sense, is really not handed. That is a shorthand. Let's talk about how the pioneering generation lost its position. It was in 1949. It was in 1949, it had been leading the African National Congress. Theirs is the ANC, from 1912 until 1949. How many presidents had been there? I think it was 7. I think Xuma was the 7th. First it was Dube, it was Mahato, it was Mahabane, it was Gumede, it was Seme, it was, So anyway, so then they go to Xuma and say to Xuma, listen, we need to change the ANC, things are not working well, we are not making progress. And Xuma says, no, you are youngsters, you cannot come and tell me, I'm a distinguished man, I have a medical degree from overseas. And then at 12 o'clock at night, he chased them out of his house in Sophiatown. Then they went and started looking around for somebody who could challenge him, and found somebody who was not a member of the ANC at the time, signed him up as the member of the ANC, and ran him against Xuma, and that person won. So that was power not being handed over to the next generation. That was the next generation stepping up and taking its responsibility of leadership. Now, I mention this historical example because I want to come to our generation, I suppose, to whom the baton needs to be passed. Now, it's not going to be handed for free. If you check, for the past 25 years now, we've been led by one generation. Things are not getting better. I have to say. It's difficult for me to say because I spend so much time in government. In a sense, you could say I was part of the problem. I told you that I have many sins. So you could say I was part of the problem. Really, I suppose the short point is, if our generation is unable to step to the plate and assume the responsibility of leadership, the generation after us will push us away and take over the responsibility of leadership. Because, as you say, it's getting co-opted and all of that. If we do not have the moral courage to do the right thing, those who are courageous will step in and take over. That's just how things are. And believe me, there's going to be change in South Africa. There is change in South Africa. The argument that we are making here is that let us learn from the generations that have come from us, that in the context in which we live in, you cannot lead if you are not really educated. That is the point. And that we need to change the nature of politics, because part of the problem with the problems that we have is what I call the politics of the crowd. Because it is easy for somebody to lead if they pursue the politics of the crowd. When you do not argue, we do not listen to your argument, your reasoned arguments. What you do, you stand in front, where you're a crowd there, you shout and promise us everything else, we give you a vote, you lead, and that's it. So that is what has to change in our society. It's fundamental to the political culture that has to change. That we have to start having a serious argument about what kind of leadership do we need. And let those who want to lead us to demonstrate that they are worthy of being our leaders. Because really what happens right now, it depends how much money you have and who can shout the most, and those people are the people who become the leaders. So that is what we need to remove from our culture, because as I said in the lecture, actually, it is new. We need to reclaim our heritage of intellectual leadership, because this is who we are. This is who John Langalibalele Dube was. You know, just one little thing before I sit down. You know, when Pixlika Isagaseme became a lawyer, was admitted as a lawyer, and then his friend, Alfred Mangena, opened the practice in Pretoria, and Pixley opened the practice in Johannesburg. They say he used to be nicely dressed, not like me. Nicely dressed, white shirt and nicely dressed, and he'll go to court. Especially they say Johannesburg will come to a standstill. Everybody will go to the Johannesburg Magistrate Court to listen to this black man who will be arguing a case. And he had an American accent. They were not going to the court to listen to him shouting. They were attracted by his persuasive argument. That was the caliber of leadership that we had. The same thing with Lembede, AP Mda, we can go on and on. This idea that to be a leader, you have to shout the most is foreign. It's not part of our tradition. It's something that happened, to be precise, it's something that happened perhaps about 25 or so years ago. Because as I said, look at those photos of the ANC conference in 1990. Just, if you have a time, Google it. Look at each and every one of those people there. They're dressed in a particular way because they are thinking they are going to have debate and argument. That is the kind of leadership that we need. So, of course, we can blame others, but each generation has to assume its responsibilities and step up. And just one last thing about the state, I know. Yes, there was a problem from the beginning. The formation of the African state and the problem, the inheritance, in a sense, from the colonial state, and that even the state itself was not transformed. There is no doubt about that. This disjuncture between the rulers and the ruled, that disjuncture comes from there, because right from the beginning, the colonial state did not see itself as part of the people. That transformation has to take place. But how society changes, whether a society changes or not, is really dependent on whether the people that the state leads are prepared to change that state and that society. And that's the reason why we are putting this emphasis on this new generation of leaders, that if they are to assume the position of responsibility, of leadership, there are certain things that they need to change, because the challenges that we face today are more complex and are more difficult. Thank you.
Sunborne, Lungile Dube, no affiliations. Thank you for the opportunity and for such a great lecture. I am obviously coming from the gender perspective.
Yes.
Because I'm a woman, and I'm saying that for a very specific reason. Okay. So I have a problem. There's a problem with how we treat the gender issue within our space in South Africa as a whole, and then wherever we get, power to talk about it. It's like we feature it as if we are detached from it. Therefore, it does not necessarily stay within a conversation. Like right now, we had, there was an introduction by Mam Lebo, and then she did mention about a gender issue, and then therefore, in fact, when Dr. Bongani Ngulunga started the conversation, he also was bitly featuring it within the J.L. Dube lecture. And I've read some of his stuff, and I've, in my own understanding, understand that he's a radical intellectual, right? And depending on how we understand a radical intellectual, but I understand it from that perspective. And for me, having to challenge this perspective means that even you who's coming within the space, understanding the situation that we are in our country right now, maybe the engagement should differ from just a feature, because we are all part of the problem. When the campaign of Am I Next starts, it's not starting from a woman, but it's from both genders, in fact, from all genders. So when now a topic of Charlotte Maxege is raised, and then Nokutela is raised, and then there's no continuation of the greatness of such, because the focus is on J.L. Dube, that is John Langalibalele Dube. It loses momentum. So for me, maybe the question of Umsibi, Professor Msibi is very relevant, the last one where he says, has the master not found other means, to capture us? Because we have been captured and we cannot understand how is it that we have been captured. But at this very moment, we are raising issues of like gender, blah, 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 but we are not attached, we are detached from it. So maybe my argument is from that perspective.
My name is Sandy Sokuzwayo. I'm going to try to be very brief. I'm not sure about the relevancy of these questions, but I find it to be the perfect platform for them. My questions were actually aimed at Mr. Ngulunga. The first question I wanted to ask is about white monopoly capital. What is his take on white monopoly capital? The use of Eurocentric education in an Afrocentric setting, and is it helpful in any way? Excuse me. I also like to find out from him what is his take on the saying behind that the current government is in office but not in power.
When I was at university in the 60s and 70s, there was a fundamentally interesting debate between the Marxists and the liberals. And the Marxist rhetoric and dialect was incredibly powerful. And I found that a most interesting debate. And I think it's rather disappointing that we find now that this Marxist-Leninist dialectic has disappeared. Because although I am not a Marxist myself, I found the Marxist dialectic incredibly useful intellectually for pointing out what was wrong. And the debate between the liberals and the Marxists, incredibly fascinating. I once asked Joe Slovo about this, and his reply to me was, and this was at Gadesa where I did some work, he said to me, although the new constitution will be a liberal democratic one, he still believed in the moral superiority of socialism. But I'm posing, surely there is more. Surely that dialectic can still be of use to us.
I mean, I like this, that the government is in office, not in power. Now I have an excuse for all my failures in government. I mean, because we're in office, but not in power. Look, you know what surprised me, and perhaps I shouldn't be sharing these things, is that, I mean, of course, I mean, there is indeed a sense, especially when you are in government, it is one of the most extraordinary things that people who are in government think that they do not have the power that they need or they deserve to have. They think there is a bigger power outside, and then that serves an excuse not to do the things that need to be done. And what normally happens, this is not to say there are no other social institutions that will power like capital, as you mentioned. I mean, there are those, I mean, that constrain what government or what a state can do. It is true. But I think governments control actually quite a lot of things. You'll be surprised. I mean, if governments do their jobs properly, they can change lives. And indeed, I mean, in certain senses, they change life. Without a scholarship, most of us wouldn't be here. right? That is government changing lives. I mean, so it is easy to make all sorts of excuses. I mean, and say we are in office, we are not in power, while actually you wield enormous power that can make significant changes. After all, we're talking about Dube, who and his wife built a school. I mean, if you were to ask politicians now to build a school from their own pockets and going around, they will tell you a long tale about why it cannot be done. But we are talking about the late 1800s and early 1800s. Mafukuzela built a school, started a newspaper, and did this and that and that. Then, with absolutely nothing, and it was not him alone. So I do think that we should expect more and ask for more from our political leaders. In the same manner, we should do the same, I think, from university managers. It is true that the Marxist critique has not really disappeared. I mean, I think it has lost the traction, the intellectual traction that it had. And I think that is partly because a generation which was at the forefront of that, I mean, in a sense, has disappeared or is disappearing. And I think you see that. But I also think that there is a new generation that has also brought something slightly different to intellectual analysis. I mean, as we are talking about a generation that is talking about Fanon, few of some of the scholars, I mean, who were advocating Marxist analysis centered race in their analysis at the time, even though a country like South Africa, race was such a central issue. I mean, so there's a bit of a rebalancing, but I also think that there's a generation that has been lost, and we see it. We see it in the analysis that we see. It is mostly, when you check, when people analyze what is going on in South Africa, they talk about individuals in the main. So and so and so and so, I mean, it descends into gossip. You lose the broader picture. My sister, we are right, I mean, about gender featuring. It is a problem, and a part of me says, I mean, even the fact that people are thinking about it actually may be a little bit of progress. I'm not saying we should celebrate it. You know, when there was a moment where people just thought it was okay not even to mention women and their contribution, say, to emancipation, for instance. But I think there is a lot more that can be done. I mean, to center gender in our analysis, I mean, so that we avoid what you call featuring. It is that, and especially in a lecture like this is a bit difficult because this is a lecture about John Langalibalele Dube. I mean, so you have to, and I mean, when you saw me talking about Maxeke and Nokutela, it's because I was quite conscious that sometimes we write off women from history. And it was a sense trying to bring women in and to say we are where we are because also of the struggles and contributions of women. But I think there is a lot more that we can do. And just Afrocentrism and Eurocentrism, yes, true. There is, as I said, a new generation that is bringing new perspectives. I mean, the Afrocentric perspective, I think, is a step in the right direction. But I think we'll have to come to a point where all knowledge, in a sense, matters and we engage all perspectives, because I think that's how we'll make progress. The notion that there are certain knowledges that you need to exclude because we are either in Africa or in Asia, I just don't think that's the right way to go. As I said, we build on top of what we have found. I mean, that's how we make human progress. And I think we have to do the same thing with scholarship and in producing knowledge. And thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. That is really appreciated. Then we are going to take these next 2 minutes to have a message from the Dube family. And then after that, we've got the last speaker, not really a speaker, somebody to come and thank everybody. So for now, let's have Ubaba Ulanga Dube, just to give us a message from the Dube family, a message of encouragement and support for this initiative. We're getting there. Just be patient a bit. like the old generation, the pioneering generation. It was very patient.
Thanks, Prof. Let me take this opportunity to greet everyone. Yes, everyone's been greeted, and I think it suffices to say all protocol observed. And that word, I think it was a woman that coined it, because we know how women are creative. And ladies and gentlemen, fellow students, members from different faith formations, we're greatly honored when we continuously seeing the legacy of our grandfather being kept alive in this way. And it is indeed a question. Actually, there are many questions that one needs to raise, but because of time limitations, one cannot sort of unpack. But again, I think we need to thank the deeper political insights that have been shared by Dr. Ngulunga, touching on our great heroes and heroines, particularly my grandfather. As you all know, that all his achievements emanated from humble beginnings. As a young man, in fact, what shaped his vision is because of the suffrage that it enjoyed at a young age. Hence, all what he did, he had actually put a young boy and a girl, particularly the youth, at the center of his thoughts. And he managed to inculcate that culture in as much as the ground was not leveled, was not even at the time when he undertook this journey of discovering. And in certain quarters within his communities, people were saying, no, Dube is just playing around with us. All what he's trying to do, he's not going to succeed. We are fuguzela, meaning that he's just wasting his energies. Yes, our message from the family is simple. But at the same time, it leaves us with many questions. One of those questions is saying, the young man touched on a very important aspect of saying, questioning that, is the current government in power? I don't think so. Because the masses gave them the mandate to execute and create these meaningful changes. Yes, my grandfather started one of the foremost black institutions so that our people can be skilled. How many skills institutions are there in our rural communities, in our townships? Today, if you can ask any of the local politicians, or let's ask ourselves one question to say, are we having a good leadership? Are they leading from the front? What kind of politics are we talking about? Are we talking about stomach politics? Or are we talking about the people that were really made and produced by the struggle that we endured? Now, in closing, I want to say, through Mr. Chair, we'd like to thank the university for all the efforts, together with your organizing team, to keep the legacy alive. And also, a request would be to say, such forums and such conversations need to be taken right where people are, particularly for our youth. In fact, I would like to extend an invitation for February 11 next year, what we are setting to do is to bring all, those retired professors, your legal minds, the think tank, to come face to face with your grade 11 and grade 12s, because there's actually a serious disconnect. We only expect these young boys and girls to act and do miracles when we don't do justice to say, okay, for a student that goes to Ohlanga High School today, we expect that young boy and girl to excel when they have to do, mathematics or science subject. If you can go now or tomorrow morning to Ohlanga Institute and check at the library, maybe we'll find about 10 or 15 books. And if you are to go to the chemistry section, you won't even see a beaker, but you'll find a cup. And then you expect those young boys and girls to excel. But again, ladies and gentlemen, I think this should be a question, and we need to have this conversation so that our young kids, boys and girls, should benefit. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity.
Good evening. I came here happily, and I've had a wonderful time, except right at the beginning when I sat and looked down the program and saw my own name at the end of it. I just wanted to hear the lecture. And so I apologize for these partly improvised remarks. I asked Professor Moletsani for guidance as to who I should thank, and she said everybody. And I also asked why it was that I didn't know about this, and she said my colleague Dr. Masondo was supposed to tell me that I was on the program. So I'm going to sort of do what you asked me, Professor Moletsani. I would like to thank everybody except Dr. Masondo. And more specifically, I have a short list here. First, the members of the Dube family for honoring this event with your presence and the program with your ongoing association. It's immensely meaningful. Second, Professor Moletsani and the JL Dube Lecture Organizing Committee and everyone who has assisted you, both who we've seen and who we haven't seen behind the scenes, for bringing about this event. Third, Professor Mkhize, he's wearing a tie. You knew. You've been spending too much time with those rich people in Joburg. Ties aren't so common here in KZN. But Professor Mkhize, for your leadership of the College of Humanities. Dr. Ngulunga for the lecture itself, which if they gave me enough rope, I would spend more time praising it than it took you to give it. Let me just say that thank you for a very valuable contribution to the growing body of scholarship and reflection that is the accumulated Dube lectures over the years. That was really, really wonderful. And then more broadly, everybody, students, including student officials, SRC members, staff of both this institution and other institutions, including those in leadership capacities, my friend and colleague, Professor Nsibi, members of government and of the public, members of and leaders of civic and faith-based organizations, including especially those with some kind of association with JL Dube. And then, when I'm not a bureaucrat, I'm a philosopher, also those opposed to organizations, including anarchists. Thank you very much for being together to make this event a success.
Well, seeing that the dean didn't thank me as a program director, I'll have to thank myself. I've worked the whole night here and driven this trip. Okay, thank you. Colleagues, it is the tradition and the culture of this lecture that we understand it as a contribution to social cohesion and the development of knowledge. So it is a project that adds to the value of our society moving forward. Therefore, we always close it by singing the national anthem. I'll ask us to do that, and as soon as we are done with it, we'll then go. So let's sing the national anthem. Nkosi sikeleli Afrika aluphakanyiswa uphondo lwayo bizwa imithandazo yethu Nkosi sikeleli thina lusapho lwayo murena buluka sitshaba sa Yesu ufedise dintwa dimatswenye usibuluke sibuluke sitshaba sa Yesu sitshaba sa South Africa, South Africa, and die Blauwal ons gemel, die diepte van ons Heer. Ons Even die zijn onvolzin, sounds the call to come together, and united we shall stand. Let us speak and strive for freedom in South Africa.